Hast du etwas Zeit für mich? Singe ich ein Lied für dich.
Every once in a while, you have to, in life, sit back, relax, crack open a cold one with yourself, and put your feet up in the air for a first-class cinematic experience. I am speaking, of course, of Zack Snyder's 2009 adaptation of the classic Alan Moore graphic novel, Watchmen. From time to time, the world feels saturated with such dread, panic, melancholy, cynicism, and angst that one needs to take a long afternoon and watch a 3.5-hour cape flick that pushes dread, panic, cynicism, melancholy, and angst to new, shiny spandex-clad heights. Watchmen is the perfect superhero movie. It has costumes. It has boobs, asses, abs, and dicks. It has giant explosions, secret government labs, gritty philosophical themes, tortured anti-heroes, generational trauma, Richard Nixon screaming, "Jesus Christ, Henry!" and almost a solid hour of heavily choreographed hand-to-hand ass-kicking. It has commentary on nuclear strategy, the cycle of victimization and forgiveness, American imperialism, the counterculture, fusion energy, crime and punishment, and Alexander the Great. Its sole defect, its one flaw, is that there is only one scene where Malin Ackerman is completely naked. Snyder's tragic lack of directorial vision in this regard is offset and compensated only by the fact that said scene with Malin Ackerman completely naked, aka Silk Spectre, is one of the hottest things I've ever seen on film. But lest you go astray thinking that Watchmen is just another depraved, childish, big-budget sensorium of unrealistic wire kung fu and perfectly lit soft porn erotica, first, let me counsel you. It is so much more. What Watchmen is really about, and what the graphic novel by the British anarchist poet Alan Moore's rich story building serves to showcase, is the range of different human responses in the face of a terminal catastrophe. Watchmen, ultimately, is a movie about how we confront the end of the world, and that is why I'm talking about it now.
Hast du etwas Zeit für mich? Singe ich ein Lied für dich von 99 Luftballons auf ihrem Weg zum Horizont.
I have recently been taken with reading the poet Rainer Marie Rilke, and I am not usually in the position to be interested in this sort of poetry, although I have to say I have been kind of gravitating intellectually and aesthetically towards that sort of Weimar Germany or James Joycean Ireland or Virginia Woolf in England kind of 1920s freeform modern literature. Rilke was a predecessor to that movement, and I don't think I fully recognized him the first time I saw him because I read Archaic Torso of Apollo, and I thought there was a gesture of something transcendent in that poem. And even having witnessed the actual Archaic Torso of Apollo, which is one of the marbles in the collection of the Vatican Museum, and stood there and looked at it, and the plaque says, yes, the one the poem is about, and I looked it up, I looked at the Archaic Torso, I looked at the poem, I looked at the Archaic Torso, I looked back to the poem, I thought, and then that was the last time I thought about Rilke until Thomas Merton brought him up. And Merton was a 20th century Christian monastic. He was a Trappist monk. He lived for most of his life, I believe, in a monastery in Kentucky. And he was fascinated by other religions. The last book that Thomas Merton ever wrote was called The Way of Chongzu, which is his reflections as a Christian mystic on the classics of the book called the Chongsu and then the Tao Te Ching. And I was fascinated with Merton because, in part because of his biography, in part because of his association with Martin Luther King Jr., and arguably his status like King as a martyr, someone who was murdered. Merton was speaking out strongly against the Vietnam War and had started to air more and more concerns about the inadequacies of the investigation into JFK's murder, and as a result had come under government surveillance. He was found under quite suspicious circumstances in a hotel in Thailand, having apparently died of faulty electrical wiring in a fan. And you can look into what happened to Thomas Merton and reach your own conclusions. I don't have any special expertise there, but Merton's denouncement of what he called the unspeakable, this rogue element of deep American civilization that had run amok in the Near East and Southeast Asia. Merton looked at that and correctly characterized it as a national security state takeover from within the inside of democracy, and accused the same people associated with the rise of the national security state with the murder of JFK. Anyway, Merton, before that, rewind maybe 20 years, used to give lectures to novitiates at his monastery. And it's to our great good fortune that those were, in many cases, recorded. And we have Thomas Merton's lectures, and they are remarkable. I posted one of them, which I will link in the episode description, about the nature of love. And anyway, there, Merton is talking about Rilke and his wonderful text, Letter to a Young Poet, where he talks about how the poet is a lighthouse whose task is to stand at, I'm paraphrasing here, but to stand at the edge of what is known and what is conventional, and to burn and shine so brightly, reflected and refracted in their own way, that it's visible from far enough off that they can guide the ships away from the rocks. It's a beautiful image. It really takes you places when you drop the word poet and substitute the word human being. I then happened to have been gifted a wonderful book of a collection of Rilke's poetry, the commentary by Robert Bly, who is also a new name for me, but one of the most acclaimed English language translators of the 20th century and a National Book Award winner. And he had this selection with German on the left, which I don't speak really except for like 15 words, and then English on the right. So a dual language edition with essays and endnotes. And I was amazed flipping through at poems like Sunset, or the last thing that he ever wrote, apparently, which was the Hymns to Orpheus. And in the Hymns to Orpheus, Rilke has this line that he drops where he says, "To praise is the whole thing." And I've been struggling with that recently. What Rilke was saying there is that to find the ode, to find the joy, to find the beauty, you have to go towards the things that are worthy of praise and praise them. And as someone who understands himself very closely to be a critic, someone whose primary responsibility is to denounce lies and notice flaws in thinking that are large scale and affect broad human cognitive processes, as well as the ideological movements of countries, religions, political parties, etc. Analyzing those patterns, one tends to develop a very bleak and pessimistic view of reality. And what I would propose is that perhaps the alchemical reagent that can dissolve our current problems is not pouring more and more scorn and derision upon objects which we already see and understand as despicable. And if at any rate we do not yet see them as despicable, the case will be readily made in the future. That is one way by which the word is passed. Another way is by coming together and talking about things we love. And so I have a big, stupid fucking boner right now for talking about Watchmen. Zack Snyder's 2009 movie, arguably the only good movie Zack Snyder ever made. Now, audience, as you already know, and as I'm about to say, yes, I am telepathic. I do hear your thoughts, your loud ass audience thoughts. You hear yourself saying, Will, why in the face of a global humanitarian crisis, in the face of a climate catastrophe tidal wave, an unspeakable genocide in Gaza, a fascist takeover of the United States, and about 10 trillion other unbearable daily humiliations of late capitalism, are you trying to bring up a Cape Shit 2009 movie by the guy who also made Batman vs. Superman and the most grotesquely bloated movie I have ever seen, the director's cut of Justice League? Why, O Anchor, with this cataclysmic tsunami bearing down upon us, do you divert our attention into this neon latex and bad guys 3.5 hour punch 'em up? And what I would pray you to understand, dear audience, what I would ask you to take as a token of faith in the realm, is that there is a reason. And that Watchmen is not only just a good movie and an entertaining movie, which it certainly is, regardless of how many of your brain cells you want to turn on while you're watching it. It is also a great movie, a beautiful movie, often quite a sexy, visually stimulating movie, and most importantly of all, the kind of movie that can be 3.5 hours long and yet never bore you or humiliate or insult your intelligence with plot holes and Deus Ex Machina bullshit or overly drawn out grotesque violence. And I think that the reason why is because the source material that they were working with from Alan Moore is so rich and so deep. Now, full disclosure, I have not read Watchmen. I have, however, read V for Vendetta, which is Alan Moore's graphic novel, which the Wachowskis later turned into the movie with Natalie Portman. And I have to say, reading V for Vendetta is pretty cool. Now, I did not find the art style in V for Vendetta particularly great, nor am I some kind of connoisseur of graphic novels or comics. In fact, I basically know nothing about them. But I have to say, V for Vendetta is is worth a look. I actually learned a lot of poetry reading Alan Moore's work. He likes William Blake, which makes sense when you start to look at some of his more Gnostic and esoteric influences, both for, well, Blake and for Alan Moore. Alan Moore, for the record, is an occultist and an anarchist and fucking rocks. Anyway, Watchmen, the source material, it's by Alan Moore, so having read Promethea as well, at least the beginning of it, and V for Vendetta, I feel somewhat authorized to say that Zack Snyder had a lot to work with. Maybe that's why his movie worked, is because someone else wrote the plot for him, and all he had to do was make it look cool. And Jesus Christ, he made it look cool. I mean, wow. It became a whole thing. The simultaneous darkening and saturation, the costumes, the sets, the music. It's immersive. It's amazing. And it's the fucking Cold War, dude. And god damn, I miss the Cold War. Not the part where we almost destroyed the planet and ran, concentration camps around the world. Not that part of the Cold War. But like the kind of shit Jackie Kennedy used to wear, or the British invasion, or watching Vietnam on your living room television while you eat family with your dinner. While you eat family with your dinner. Sorry, I met a particularly grouchy record store owner, who I love, by the way, and he even gave me a free record at one point from the back that I don't think anyone else wanted. And I talked to him about the 60s and the 70s, and man, I'm falling into the classic fucking young white guy trap, going up to an older white guy and being like, dude, what was it like to be alive in the 60s? Did you guys just walk down the street naked and drop acid? And it's like, yes, often cases, but a lot of it for most Americans was, as he said, having Vietnam for dinner in all the senses that implies. So for those of you who haven't seen Watchmen, or for those of you who have seen Watchmen, but you were 15 and you were stoned, here's a quick refresher. It is, I believe, the early 1980s when the plot is unrolling, and Richard Nixon has been elected 5 times. And yes, before you ask, this is the Nixon universe where Henry Kissinger gets to come along for all of that. So in essence, Henry Kissinger has also been elected 5 times. And the US and the Soviet Union are close to nuclear annihilation. The very first shot of the movie, if I remember correctly, or at least one of the very first shots of the movie, is watching the news, and what's on the news is the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. And they are pushing the Doomsday clock a little closer to midnight. Now, a quick item of clarification here. One of the strange cultural phenomena that has happened ever since Watchmen is people thinking that the Doomsday clock is just a gag in Watchmen. The Doomsday clock and the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists are both completely real things, and they go by exactly that name. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists was a periodical and the proceedings of various conferences held between leading academic researchers, mostly physicists, astronomers, mathematicians, and basically the guilty consciences of all the people that had been involved, first in nuclear bomb research and then in the development of hydrogen bombs. They were so freaked out by what they created that they made essentially a citizens' action committee that has been whirring and humming along for something like 70 years now. And they do actually publish a Doomsday clock. And we are significantly closer on the Doomsday clock in 2025 than we were in the tensest and worst moments of the Cold War, including the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the reason why is because the overall situation of nuclear proliferation has not improved. There are, in fact, more nuclear weapons wielding nations, including countries like North Korea and even Israel and Pakistan and India acquiring weapons kind of later in the game in the 70s and 80s. And the world has also added the twin crises of climate change and a mass refugee crisis, which is challenging national sovereignty and creating things like Brexit. So taking those factors together, climate change, refugees, now also the threat of a new pandemic, and the proliferation of nuclear weapons and active wars between countries that have nuclear weapons, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists says we are very close to a terminal disaster. And so that's where Watchmen starts. And Watchmen is, in essence, a movie about the end of the world and how different characters, how people with different understandings, different backgrounds, different ideas respond to the threat of annihilation. And that's what the different superheroes in the cast of superhero characters in Watchmen is about. Each of them represents an archetype or an embodiment of a specific kind of response that someone has to being told that the end of the world is nigh. So, into this grim, grinding cage of superpower militarism and terminal disaster steps are costumed superheroes. And they have formed I guess you could also call it a citizens action committee of mostly street brawlers who eventually graduate to apparently trying to address, world political and existential problems and not just catching criminals in their neighborhood. That's usually part of the superhero arc. It starts with, I'm going to stop this bank robber. And then, after 30 pages of comic book, now you have to stop the Green Goblin. And then after another, 50 pages of comic book, you have to stop an alien invasion of planet Earth, right? There's a certain power creep that happens with superheroes that's famous, and Watchmen is certainly no exception. So let's introduce some of the characters. The first character we should talk about is probably the hardest to understand, a character that seems less like a person and more like an extended metaphor, which is Dr. Manhattan. Dr. Manhattan's story goes like this. He's a physicist in the 60s. He's working on government research relating to advanced physics. He's built, or partakes of this lab where they do crazy experiments with, I think it's called a intrinsic field subtractor in Watchmen. And he's married and so on. And one day there's a terrible accident at the lab and he gets locked inside this time-controlled vault with his intrinsic field subtractor running. And then he breaks apart into 10 million pieces while getting electrocuted by blue lightning in a Jesus Christ pose. So, you tell me what happened. Slain by his own creation. Damn, I hate it when that happens. But good news, because later guards at the government facility that he's at notice a nervous system walking around, a glowing blue blob of a nervous system. Later on, a circulatory system is spotted. And then finally, he reassembles himself and levitates Christ-like above, the cafeteria with all his old physics buddies in it. And he is glowing blue, perfectly jacked, like Giga Chad jacked, with a fucking very prominent blue swinging dong. And he tries to have like a normal human relationship with his wife, but the problem is that he's kind of a god now. Like, he's indestructible. He can practically teleport. He can rearrange matter at the subatomic level. He can slow down and speed up his perception of time. He can see the future. He is essentially a walking god, man, which is, of course, why Richard Nixon asks him to intervene in Vietnam. Because in this timeline, America doesn't lose the Vietnam War. America deploys Dr. Manhattan, who, in a literally unforgettable scene, it's the Apocalypse Now helicopter gunship scene with Ride of the Valkyries playing and, you know, the smell of napalm in the morning and all of that. But there's a fucking 180-foot tall blue guy, and yes, again, with a giant swinging blue dong, who is just making entire, you know, groups of Vietnamese villagers just splat into 1,000 little gory pieces. And that's how America wins the Vietnam War, is with the intervention of Blue Dr. Manhattan. Now, let's just not insult anyone's intelligence. Dr. Manhattan is an allegory for nuclear weapons. He produces radiation that gives the people that he worked with and the people that he loved terrible illnesses. He is used as a deterrent against Russia and their nuclear weapons. He is literally named Dr. fucking Manhattan. And, you know, so if you just apply the allegory, what happened is that Richard Nixon got the ability to use nuclear weapons in Vietnam. I think that one of the political questions that Alan Moore must have asked himself when he was writing Watchmen is, what if Nixon actually did do what he had in fact threatened to do many, many times, which was to use nuclear weapons in Vietnam? Nixon had to be restrained from this, first by Kissinger, who thought it would trigger World War III, and then later by the public when they found out, because essentially Nixon confided to Kissinger. Kissinger basically shit his pants with fear, because at this very moment, Richard Nixon was getting so drunk over the Watergate scandal and so stressed out and crazy that he was talking to, you know, the presidential portraits, like staying up until 2 a.m. and carrying on in, you know, hillbilly vernacular, Shakespearean, King Lear fucking soliloquies with these White House presidential oil painting portraits. And Kissinger was like, I do not think it would be prudent for the national interest if we were to use nuclear weapons against a little fourth-rate power like Vietnam. And then Kissinger, who claimed he hated the press and hated leakers, called his friends in the press and leaked that that was happening. And as a result, one of the largest protests in human history broke out. Washington, D.C. was packed with over 1 million people who swarmed and surrounded and besieged first the White House, then the Pentagon, and then finally also the Capitol building, and blocked traffic, blocked sidewalks, held up signs. The yuppies tried to levitate the Pentagon. I guess we're still waiting to find out whether that'll work. Technically, scientifically, we don't know whether the magic spell has resolved yet. It could be that you can levitate the Pentagon. It just takes 100 years. So, you know, keep an open mind. But it stopped Nixon, arguably, from actually doing it. And what Watchmen asks us to consider is, what if he had done it? What if he had nuked Vietnam? And if he had nuked Vietnam, who on fucking earth could tell him what he couldn't do? And so therefore, like I said earlier, he was elected 5 times. So this is the world where Nixon just becomes the emperor of America. And in the world where Nixon is the emperor of America, the way that Nixon became emperor of America, namely Dr. Manhattan, proves to be the biggest liability in the system of world power. So as for the man himself, he's currently living at, you know, like a Fort Detrick style, like military super base, and is working with this other character named Ozymandias, who we will also be talking about, on making like a fusion reactor that would provide unlimited clean energy, like the Watchmen equivalent of a tokamak or a plasma reactor. Also, sometimes I think called a toroid reactor. So now that we've talked about the character that you could quite easily say represents, for example, naked power, we can talk about a character that I found particularly transparent, but may not appear so to other people, which is Ozymandias. And here we have a couple of overlapping tropes. So the first trope is the trope of the ultra wealthy techno realist, you might call it. A person that, would attend the World Economic Forum, who believes that wars are the outcome of scarcity, that there are underlying economic causes for foreign conflict and internal lack of stability. It's a strange thing, the billionaire class appears to have read their marks. And I think the character that Ozymandias most neatly reminds me of is Bill Gates, a person who creates a monopolistic supercorp and then funnels profits into these real or sinister humanitarian interventions in all these different countries, including things like mass vaccination campaigns, which are equally shady, and so on. But, a person who essentially believes that war is the result of miscommunication and competition over scarce resources, that politics is the enemy, and that if you spend enough money on breakthrough technologies, let's just find a peaceful civilian use for all this cutting edge physics that has only been able to give us larger and scarier weapons of destruction. That's the first layer of Ozymandias, the sort of brilliant, like a synthesis, if you want to dip into the Marvel universe. And I mean, why not? We're already talking about superheroes. It's not like I'd lose any momentum. But a character that's sort of a crossover between Doctor Strange and Iron Man, where he has Iron Man's wealth and resources and also has, Doctor Strange's analytic mind and ability to kind of look down into the future and see what the possibilities are. So in his superhero persona, he is two things. Number one, he is both the smartest and the best fighter of all of the different Watchmen. I'm going to make an effort to give few spoilers, but yeah, so he's a badass. He's an economic realist and a sort of techno optimist. Again, basically a stand-in for the standard Davos attendee. And he also is obsessed with characters like Alexander the Great and pharaohs like Ramses II. He clearly wants absolute power. He says the only person who he ever felt a human relation to, the only person that got him, was Alexander the Great, and, quote, his dream of an empire that unified the world. At one point, Ozymandias is meeting with all the other Watchmen, and he says, we can save this world with the right leadership. And at that point, the next character we'll be talking about, or maybe I'll save him for last so that his irony makes a little more sense. The comedian bursts in and says, well, I guess that'd be you, right? In other words, we need to expand under your guidance. And the comedian's response to Ozymandias' plan to, save the world through the ending scarcity and so on, is that it's bullshit and it won't work. And his exact line is that you will be the smartest man left standing on the cinders because there's no stopping Doomsday. And that's where the poem comes in. So the name Ozymandias comes from a Percy Shelley poem of the same title. And again, coming back to Alan Moore's awesome taste in poetry, this is how I first heard Percy Shelley's poem Ozymandias, and maybe this will be your first time hearing it, but maybe I doubt that. Ozymandias, Percy Shelley, 1818. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things. The hand that mocked them, and the heart that fed, and on the pedestal these words appear, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. I think the image that comes to mind when we hear that is Egypt. You know, the Egyptian Empire is 5,500 years old in its civilizational lineage, if not older. I think most scholars date the beginning of the Old Period in Egypt or I think it's called the Old Kingdom, sorry. The Old Kingdom in Egypt, the establishment of dynastic rule, something like 3,800 BCE. The pyramids of the Gizeh Plateau were constructed between 2,700 and 2,400 BCE. I mean, to put that into perspective, the once thought to be purely mythical Battle of Troy, in which the Achaeans lay siege to, Troy and destroy it, which, by the way, was again thought to be just a story in a book until Heinrich Schliemann and his amateur archaeologists basically read the Iliad very carefully, noted the geographic details, went there and started digging and actually found Troy almost fucking immediately and proceeded to destroy a huge amount of the archaeological artifacts present by not knowing what the fuck they were doing and essentially digging straight down through the other cultural layers. So anyway, Schliemann's Trench, if you have an archaeological heart to break, then that's the word. But at any rate, the kinds of things that are described in the Iliad of, the Mycenaean Greeks going up against the Trojans and stuff, that ain't coming for over 1,000 years by the time that the pyramid in the Gizeh Plateau is going up. So the antiquity of Egypt, a culture that, as Western Europeans used to say about the Romans, were antique even to themselves. That's the image. And indeed, Ozymandias's, sort of Batcave layer draws very heavily on ancient Egyptian art, which I've always found ancient Egyptian carvings in particular to have a kind of visual magic and powerful and somewhat terrifying aura behind them. The Egyptian gods in particular, and like walls covered in hieroglyphics, gives me a real innate sense of awe and terror. There's something deeply spooky about Egypt, or at least ancient Egypt, that is tapped into in this movie. So not to get utterly sidetracked talking about ancient Egypt, but just to clarify, and yes, I had to look this up. So the period of Egyptian unification between Upper and Lower Egypt is usually dated to 3150 BCE, and then the start of the Old Kingdom is 27 or 2800 BCE. Everything else I said was accurate. Okay, anyway, another way in which Ozymandias is sort of a cipher for Bill Gates is that if you follow the camera as it goes into, the alleyway with the characters Night Owl and Silk Spectre, you'll actually see posters with Ozymandias's face on them proclaiming his interest in African famine relief, as well as his pursuit of fusion and nuclear fusion power, which is one of the heaviest investment areas that Bill Gates has allocated his capital into, is experimental nuclear fusion. So it's quite a close mapping. There is also among billionaires a certain strange obsession with antiquity. Ozymandias talks about how he read Alexander and Ramses's, biographies in order to get lessons from antiquity. And this is kind of how we hear billionaires speaking. Like, one of the, I guess, strange or not personality quirks of Mark Zuckerberg is that he's obsessed with Augustus Caesar, also known as Octavian, Caesar's nephew. And, Augustus's whole thing is like, oh, I found Rome a city of brick and I left it a city of marble. And like, yeah, he was a good emperor. Doesn't understand. Laughs. It's a good emperor, ma'am. Checks. It's Caligula. Anyway, so the last character I want to talk about in Watchmen before I wrap up is Rorschach. And yes, before you ask, like, this will be a multi-part thing, and there will be more to my Watchmen commentary than just talking about 3 of the characters and how it's a Cold War allegory for nuclear weapons. And, okay, so Rorschach is a superhero who wears a mask that has an ink blot on it that is constantly rearranging. And so his kind of core gimmick, the way that he presents himself, is asking people, what do you see when you look at me? When you see a homeless person on the street that you don't know anything about, when you see a stranger in the crowd, when you see someone on TV who you've never seen or heard from before, what do you take that person to be? And whatever the answer is, it says more about you than it does about me. And Rorschach, his biography is that he comes out of the sewage system of civilization. He is an unwanted child who lives with a mother who is a sex worker, who has violent pimps and Johns visiting her all the time. He is bullied and excluded at school, gets in trouble, juvenile hall, etc., etc. Ultimately, he ends up living on the street as a doomsday preacher by day, and then he straps on his mask and fights bad guys at night. And Rorschach is sort of the embodiment of the cultural conservative. He's a character that at first you sort of want to like, but then you hear him, sneering at the degeneracy of same-sex couples, or hear him talk about like the filth of fornication, and you're like, I don't know that fornication is necessarily filthy. I mean, at least not in that sense. And so he's a little bit of a prude, to be sure. But Rorschach is also one of the most morally consistent characters in Watchmen. He has a little catchphrase for it: never compromise, even in the face of Armageddon. And he also talks with one of these kinds of voices. And that gets a little much to listen to, but he is wonderfully acted in this movie. But he represents the conservative, principled stand that doesn't care about the consequences and doesn't care about the calculations. And he's a Kantian, he's going to stick to absolute truth and absolute commitment all the way down. He's sort of a mix between like a Byronic hero and a Kantian moral philosopher. The Rorschach character is truly fascinating. And the role that he plays is that he's the only guy that gives a shit when the comedian is murdered. And he goes around and he rounds everybody up and says, "We got to do something about this," with his pack-a-day voice. And with that, I think I shall leave the episode for now. In the next discussion of Watchmen, because I'm trying to keep these like under an hour. I'm trying to keep these bi-directional commute length. In the next one, we'll talk about Silk Spectre, and we will talk about some of the plot elements in Watchmen and what they mean. Like, there's a whole subplot called the Black Freighter, which is in the 3.5 hour extended cut, but isn't in the theatrical cut, which is pretty cool and interesting and worth watching, where it follows a like teenage boy who gets immersed in this comic book. And the comic book, of course, is an allegory within an allegory. And we will be discussing all of that next time on the Watchmen series. I wanted to do my own movie react channel, and I thought I would kick it off with Watchmen because it is ultimately just a good old-fashioned enjoyable movie. You know, you don't have to sit there with a notepad like I did and make 8 little pages of notes about why Dan can't fuck the hottest chick ever because there's Cold War propaganda playing when they start fucking on the couch. And just as he's trying to get his dick hard, he's hearing, you know, commercials about increasing tensions on the border in Ukraine and missiles pointed everywhere, and the military command getting stepped up to DEFCON 2, you know, a little psychosexual things like that. But no, the movie, the soundtrack has been bouncing around in my head. It's a lot of that 70s and 80s, like East Berlin, West Berlin, like disco pop, like 99 Luftballons and stuff like that. There's a lot of crossover between the soundtrack of this movie and the soundtrack of a movie like Atomic Blonde, which is another movie I would also urge on everyone as just being a plain old-fashioned good time about the Cold War. Anyway, I know I've been away. I have been visiting family and friends, but yours truly is back at the station, and we'll be having a lot more episodes coming out soon. I have a recording coming up with the American Prestige podcast guys, Danny Bessner and Derek Davidson, and then the 2 hosts of the We're Not So Different podcast, Eleanor Yanega and Jacob Aaron, and we are going to discuss The Crusades, which I just finished listening to all 10 episodes of. And so with that, I shall leave it. Thank you, audience. And either be grateful or relieved or indifferent or adamantly defiant at the next update in the Doomsday Clock, depending on which Watchmen character you're feeling like tonight.
Hast du etwas Zeit für mich, singe ich ein Lied für dich von 99 Luftballons auf ihrem Weg zum Horizont. Denkst du vielleicht gerade an mich, dann singe ich ein Lied für dich, 99 Luftballons, und das so war, wann sowas kommt. 99 Luftballons auf ihrem Weg zum Horizont, hielt mein Fuß aus dem All. Darum schickte ein General ein Fliegerstaffel hinterher, Alarm zu geben, wenn so wär. Dabei wurde am Horizont nur 99 Luftballons. 10.000 Flieger, jeder war ein großer Krieger, hielten sie für Captain Kirk. Das gab ein großes Feuerwerk, die Nachbarn haben nichts geragt und fühlten sich gleich angemacht. Dabei schoss man am Horizont auf 99 Luftballons. 99 Kriegsminister, Streichholz, Benzinkanister, hielten sich für schlaue Leute, witterten schon Wettelbeute, riefen Krieg und wollten Macht. Men wer hatte das gedacht, dass es einmal so weit kommt, wegen 99 Luftballons. 99 Luftballons. Jahre Krieg ließen keinen Platz für Sieger. Kriegsminister gibt's nichts mehr und auch keine Düsenflieger. Heute sieh ich meine Runden, seh die Welt in Trümmern liegen, haben einen Luftballon gefunden. Denk an dich und lass ihn fliegen.